The night air was a thief, stealing the last of the day's warmth from the hard-packed earth and from the thin fabric of Lena May's dress. It was a calico dress, once a pale blue dotted with tiny yellow flowers. Now, it was a rag of gray and brown, torn at the shoulder and hem, clinging to her with the damp chill of sweat and fear. The sharp edges of shale and granite bit into the soles of her feet, each step a fresh agony that sent a jolt up her legs. But the pain was distant, a dull drumbeat against the roaring silence in her head. She didn't look back. There was nothing to see but the suffocating dark and the faint, mocking glimmer of lantern light from the mining town she had just fled, a town called Progress, though she had found none there. She did not cry. The tears had dried up months ago, leaving her eyes feeling like sand and her heart like a stone in her chest. Crying was a luxury, a release she could no longer afford. It had brought her nothing but the back of his hand, the tightening of his grip, the low growl in his throat that promised worse. Boyd. His name was a foul taste in her mouth, a brand on her soul. He had a laugh that was louder than anyone else's in the saloon, a swagger that parted crowds, and hands that knew how to break things. Horses, chairs, promises, her. The blood on her wrists had dried to a flaky, dark crust. It wasn't from a cut, but from the raw, chafed skin where she had fought against the ropes he'd used this last time. The memory flickered behind her eyes, unwelcome and sharp as broken glass, the rough hemp biting into her flesh. The scent of stale whiskey on his breath as he'd leaned over her. His face a mask of ownership. "You think you can leave," he'd slurred, the words thick and ugly. "You're mine, Lena. Like this claim, like this bottle, mine." She had waited. She had learned to wait through the long, brutal months. She waited until his drunken snores filled the small, stifling cabin, a rhythmic rumble that usually haunted her sleep. But tonight, it was the sound of freedom. With teeth and raw, bleeding fingers, she had worked at the knots. Her breath held so tight in her chest it ached. The rope finally gave, and she had slipped out of the cabin like a ghost, taking nothing but the tattered dress on her back and the burning need to run until her lungs gave out. Now, her lungs were on fire, each breath a ragged tear in the cold air. Her mind was a merciful blank. It had shut itself down, refusing to process the full scope of her terror, her despair. There was no plan, no destination, just a primal instinct pushing her forward, away from the life that had been slowly crushing her, one foot in front of the other. That was all there was. The pain in her feet was real. It was a reminder that she was still alive, still moving. The cold was real. It kept her awake, alert to the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, the imagined sound of hoofbeats behind her. The landscape was an unforgiving moonscape of rock and scrub brush. The gnarled arms of mesquite trees reached out like skeletal fingers in the gloom, snagging at her dress, scratching her arms. She stumbled, her bare foot catching on a root, and fell hard, her hands and knees scraping against the gravelly soil. For a moment, she lay there, the hard ground a surprisingly solid comfort against her cheek. It would be so easy to just stay here, to let the cold take her, to simply stop. But then, a whisper surfaced from the depths of her memory. It wasn't her own thought, but a scrap of conversation she'd overheard weeks ago. Two old prospectors talking by the general store. They spoke of the jagged peaks to the west, a no-man's land that even the Apache tended to avoid. "Ain't nothing out there," one had said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Nothing but dust, wind, and some man who's living alone with his past." The other had nodded. "Holloway. Heard he was cavalry. Back in the war. Saw too much. Went out there to be left alone. Folks say he's more ghost than man now." Dust, wind, and a man living alone with his past. At the time, the words had meant nothing. Now, they were a compass point. The phrase echoed in the emptiness of her mind. A strange, hollow promise. It wasn't a promise of safety, or of comfort, or of help. It was a promise of emptiness, of solitude, a place where Boyd wouldn't think to look, because there was nothing there for a man like him to take, to break, or to own. A place where she could finally be nothing, and in being nothing, perhaps be free. She pushed herself up, her joints screaming in protest, her gaze fixed on the dark, serrated line of the mountains against the star-dusted sky. They seemed impossibly far, a fortress of stone and shadow, but they were a direction. They were a destination. She started walking again, her pace slower now, more deliberate. The initial frantic burst of adrenaline had faded, replaced by a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion. Her body was a collection of aches and pains, a vessel she was dragging across the desert floor. But her spirit, the small, bruised thing she had thought long dead, had found a flicker of purpose. It was the purpose of the hunted animal seeking a den, the simple, biological imperative to survive. As the sky began to lighten in the east, turning from inky black to a soft, bruised purple, the details of the landscape emerged. The world was shades of brown and gray, dotted with the stubborn green of creosote and sage. The air grew colder just before the dawn, a final, biting chill that sank deep into her bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, the torn fabric of her dress offering no warmth. Her shivering was uncontrollable, a violent tremor that shook her from head to toe. She thought of food, of water. Her throat was a dry, rasping passage. Her stomach was a tight, aching knot. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager lunch, a piece of dry bread she'd choked down under Boyd's watchful, suspicious eyes. The thought of water was a torment. She imagined a cool, clear stream, a deep well, even a muddy puddle. Her tongue felt thick in her mouth. The first rays of sunlight crested the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of orange and pink. The beauty of it was a cruel joke. The sun would not bring warmth and comfort, but a new kind of misery. The heat would bake the ground, reflect off the rocks, and suck the last of the moisture from her body. She needed to find shelter, a place to hide from the coming sun and from any eyes that might be searching for her. Her eyes scanned the foothills of the mountains, which now seemed marginally closer. She saw gullies, rock outcroppings, the dark mouths of what might be small caves. Anything would do. She pressed on. Her focus narrowed to the next 10 feet, then the next. The world became a blur of rock, dust, and shadow. Time lost its meaning. There was only the sun climbing higher in the sky, the heat pressing down like a physical weight, and the relentless rhythm of her own ragged breathing. She found a shallow overhang, a slice of shadow cut into a rock face. It wasn't much, but it was out of the direct sun. She collapsed onto the sandy ground, her body giving out at last. She lay on her side, curled into a ball, trying to make herself small, invisible. Sleep pulled at her, a heavy, dark tide. But every time she drifted close, an image of Boyd's face would flash in her mind. His eyes narrowed, his lip curled in a sneer, and she would jerk awake, her heart hammering against her ribs. He would be looking for her by now. He would be furious. His pride would be wounded, and his pride was a dangerous, violent thing. He would not see her as a person who had left, but as a possession that had been stolen, and he would hunt for what was his. The fear was a cold snake coiling in her gut, a more potent force than exhaustion or thirst. It was the fear that kept her from surrendering completely to the blackness. She had to keep moving. Not yet, just a little rest, just until the worst of the day's heat had passed. She lay there for hours, drifting in and out of a feverish, shallow sleep. The sun arced across the sky, its heat relentless. Her skin felt tight and burned. Her lips were cracked, and a dizzying headache pounded behind her eyes. When she finally forced herself to sit up, the world spun violently. She pressed her forehead against the cool rock of the overhang until the nausea subsided. Evening was approaching. The shadows were lengthening, and a faint breeze stirred the air. offering a hint of relief. She knew she couldn't stay here. She had to keep moving toward the mountains, toward that promise of nothingness. She got to her feet, swaying. Her legs felt like they were made of wood, stiff and unresponsive. Her feet were a mess of cuts and bruises, swollen and caked with dirt and dried blood. She barely felt them anymore. They were just the things at the end of her legs that had to carry her forward. She stumbled out of the shadow of the rock and into the golden light of the setting sun. The mountains were closer now, their slopes defined, their peaks sharp against the deepening blue sky. Somewhere in there, among the dust and the wind, was a man, a ghost, a place to disappear. She took a step, then another. Her mind was foggy, her thoughts slow and disjointed. She was operating on a single, burning command: forward, away. The words of the old prospectors were a litany, a prayer to a god she no longer believed in. Dust, wind, and a man living alone with his past. It was enough. It had to be. The sun was not yet a promise, just a vague lightening of the eastern horizon, a slow bleed of gray into the deep indigo of the night. It was in this quiet, in-between time that Rafe Holloway's day always began. He moved with the economy of a man who had long ago stripped life down to its essentials. The floorboards of the small ranch house gave a familiar groan under his weight as he crossed to the cast-iron stove. His hands, calloused and mapped with scars from rope burns and fencing wire, worked with a practiced rhythm: grind the coffee beans, measure them into the pot, pour the water from the bucket he'd filled the night before. The scent of coffee, dark and rich, was the first real thing in the morning, a small anchor in the vast sea of silence that was his life. He was a man in his early 40s, but the harsh sun and harsher memories had carved deeper lines into his face. His hair was the color of dust, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue that had seen too much sky, too much distance, and too much death. He'd been a cavalryman once, a long time ago. Now, he was just a rancher on a stretch of land that bordered the New Mexico territory, a place most people considered the edge of nowhere. For Rafe, it was the center of his world, a world that had shrunk to the size of his property 7 years ago, the day he had buried his wife, Sarah, under the lone cottonwood tree by the creek. He took his coffee to the porch, settling into the worn rocking chair that still seemed to hold her shape. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. This was his ritual to watch the sun rise, to feel the world wake up around him, and to remember. He didn't dwell on the pain of her loss anymore. That had dulled to a permanent ache, a part of him like a bone that had healed crooked. Instead, he remembered the small things: the way she hummed while she baked, the determined set of her jaw when she was mending a fence, the warmth of her hand in his as they sat here, on this same porch, watching this same sun rise. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with her absence. As the light strengthened, painting the landscape in soft shades of ochre and rose, his eyes, trained by years of scouting, automatically scanned the land. He knew every rock, every dip in the terrain, every hardy clump of grass. It was a habit he'd never broken, this constant vigilance, and that's when he saw it. Just beyond the hard-packed dirt of his yard, where the wilder, sandier soil began, was a mark that didn't belong. It wasn't the track of a coyote or a deer. It was a footprint, small, slender, bare, and it was stained dark at the heel. Rafe stopped rocking. He set his coffee cup down on the porch rail, the ceramic making a soft click in the immense quiet. He stared at the footprint for a long moment, his mind processing the information with a cold, methodical precision. A barefoot person was in trouble. The dark stain, which he knew even from this distance was dried blood, meant they were hurt. He stood up, his movement still unhurried, and stepped off the porch. He knelt by the track, his fingers hovering over the impression in the dirt. The print was shallow, indicating a light person, likely a woman. The stride to the next print was short and uneven, the steps dragging. She was exhausted. He looked up, his gaze following the faint trail as it led away from the direction of the mountains and toward his ranch, toward his well. She hadn't been wandering aimlessly. She had been heading for the one source of life for miles in any direction. He went back inside, not for a weapon, but for the small medical kit he kept on a shelf. It held little more than bandages, carbolic soap, and a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds. But it was better than nothing. He also grabbed a canteen of fresh water. Then, with the rising sun at his back, he began to follow the trail. The story of her journey was written in the dust for him to read. He saw where she had stumbled, the scuff marks and the deeper, smeared print of a hand where she had caught herself. He saw tiny, dark droplets of blood spattered on a flat, pale rock. He followed the tracks across a dry wash and through a patch of thorny scrub. He could see how she had tried to pick her way through, but the tattered scraps of fabric caught on the branches told him she had not been entirely successful. He felt a knot tighten in his gut. This was a desperate flight, not a journey. He walked faster, his long strides eating up the ground. The trail led directly to the stone well that stood 100 yards from his house. It was old, built by the people who had lived on this land before him. And it's cool. Deep water had never run dry. It was the heart of the ranch, and collapsed beside it, half in shadow, half in the new morning light, was a figure. He slowed his approach, his instincts on high alert. It could be a trap, though it seemed unlikely out here. He circled wide, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape for any sign of another person. There was nothing. Just the wind whispering through the sparse grass and the silent, still form on the ground. He came closer. It was a woman, just as he'd thought. Her hair was a tangled, matted mess, full of dust and twigs. Her dress was torn and filthy, offering little protection from the elements. She was lying on her side, curled in on herself, as if trying to ward off a blow even in unconsciousness. Her feet, visible beneath the ragged hem of her dress, were a raw, bloody ruin. He could see the exhaustion in the very lines of her body, the deep and final surrender to gravity. Rafe felt that old, familiar ache in his chest. It had been a long time since he had seen another human being this close, let alone one in such a state. For 7 years, his world had been fences, cattle, and the ghost of his wife. This woman, this broken creature at his well, was an intrusion, a disruption to the careful, quiet order of his grief. He knelt beside her. Her breathing was shallow, a faint flutter. Her face was turned away from him, pressed into the dirt. He needed to see if she was lucid, if she was dangerously injured. He reached out a hand, intending to gently touch her shoulder, to rouse her. His fingers had barely brushed the thin fabric of her dress when it happened. Her whole body flinched, a violent, convulsive shudder, as if he had burned her with a hot iron. A small, terrified sound, a choked gasp, escaped her lips. She wasn't just sleeping, she was submerged in a nightmare, and his touch had become a part of it. The reaction sent a jolt through Rafe himself. His own hand began to tremble, and he pulled it back as if he were the one who had been scalded. It wasn't her fear that shook him. It was the sudden, overwhelming memory that her reaction triggered. He was instantly transported back 7 years, to a darkened room, to the scent of sickness and herbal remedies. He saw Sarah, frail and pale in their bed, her body racked with fever. He remembered reaching for her hand and how she had sometimes flinched in her delirium, lost in a world of pain he couldn't reach. The feeling of that involuntary rejection, born of suffering, had been one of the sharpest pains of her long illness. And now, this stranger's tremor brought it all rushing back. The helplessness, the grief, the profound loneliness of watching someone you love slip away from you. For a moment, he wasn't a weathered rancher kneeling in the dirt. He was a desperate husband, his heart breaking all over again. Lena May came up from the depths of a dark, suffocating ocean. She wasn't asleep. She was gone. One moment she was forcing her feet to move. The next, she was on the ground, the world tilting and fading to black. The darkness was a relief, a place with no pain, no fear, no Boyd. But then came the touch. It was on her shoulder, a pressure, a man's touch. Her mind, still caught in the fog of exhaustion and trauma, didn't register gentleness or concern. It only registered the signal that had been burned into her nervous system: touch equals danger. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. The flinch was pure instinct, the instinct of a cornered animal. The gasp was the sound of her terror finding a voice, however small. She forced her eyes open. The world was a blinding glare of light and a confusing swirl of shapes. She tried to scramble backward, to pull herself away from the source of the touch. But her limbs wouldn't obey. They were heavy, useless things. Her eyes slowly focused on a figure kneeling beside her. A man. He was large, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. Her heart seized in her chest. He found me! Boyd found me! But then she saw his hand. It was frozen in the air between them, and it was shaking. Not with anger, not with menace. It was a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, the kind a person has when they are holding something fragile that they are afraid of breaking. His face wasn't Boyd's face. The lines around his eyes were not cruel. His mouth was set in a firm, straight line, but it wasn't a sneer. He was just watching her. His pale blue eyes held not rage, but a deep, still sadness. A shock that seemed to mirror her own. They stayed like that for a long, silent moment. A man and a woman, strangers at the edge of the world, caught in a tableau of fear and memory. Both of them were trembling. One from a past that was still hunting her, the other from a past he had never escaped. The sun climbed higher, casting their long shadows across the dry, thirsty ground, and the silence that stretched between them was heavier than any words could ever be. Awareness returned not as a sudden light, but as a slow, creeping warmth. The first thing Lena May registered was the scent. It was a clean, dry smell, the resinous perfume of old pine wood warmed by the sun. It was nothing like the stale, sour odor of unwashed linen and spilled whiskey that had permeated her life for the past year. This was a scent of stillness, of solitude, of things left undisturbed for a long time. It was the scent of peace. Her second sensation was touch. A thick, heavy blanket was tucked around her, its texture a rough but comforting wool against her skin. Beneath it, she was lying on a mattress stuffed with straw or corn husks, firm and rustling softly with her every slight movement. It was a simple bed, a humble bed, but it was a bed, not a pile of rags on the floor. Fear was a reflex, and it came next. Her eyes snapped open, her muscles tensing for a fight or a flight she knew her body could not manage. She expected to see the familiar, grimy walls of Boyd's cabin, to meet his bloodshot, possessive gaze. Instead, she saw a ceiling of rough-hewn wooden beams, grayed with age. Sunlight streamed through a small, square window, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in the air. The walls were plain, unadorned wood, scrubbed clean, besides the bed. The only other furniture was a simple, straight-backed wooden chair and a small, overturned crate that served as a nightstand. She was alone. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and a groan escaped her lips. The sound was thin and reedy in the quiet room. Every muscle in her body ached with a profound, deep-seated weariness. She let her head fall back against the flat pillow. Where was she who had brought her here? Her last memory was of the sun, the endless dust, and a well made of stone. Then, a man's shadow falling over her. The memory of his touch, the one that had jolted her from the depths of her collapse, returned. She instinctively wrapped her arms around herself, a tremor running through her. A man had found her. A man had brought her here. Her entire body braced for the inevitable. Men did not offer help without expecting payment. She knew the currency they demanded. The sound of footsteps on the wooden floor outside the room sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through her. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing hitched. The door creaked open. She held her breath, waiting for the heavy tread, the rough hands, the slurred voice. But the footsteps were light for a man, and they stopped just inside the doorway. There was a long silence, broken only by the soft thud of something being placed on the floor. Then, the footsteps retreated, and the door closed with a gentle click. Slowly, cautiously, Lena opened her eyes. On the crate beside her bed, there was a tin cup, water. The condensation on its side glistened in the sunlight. It was a simple offering, yet it was the most baffling thing she had ever seen. He had brought her water, and then he had left. He hadn't stood over her, watching her, waiting. He hadn't said a word. He had asked for nothing. She stared at the cup for a full minute, her mind struggling to make sense of it. With Boyd, a cup of water was a transaction. It was given after a chore was completed to his satisfaction, or offered as a prelude to a demand. Kindness was a weapon he used to remind her of her dependence on him. This was just water. With a trembling hand, she reached for the cup. Her fingers were weak, but they closed around the cool metal. She brought it to her lips, expecting it to be snatched away at the last second. A cruel trick, but it wasn't. She took a small, hesitant sip. The water was cool and clean, tasting faintly of minerals and stone. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It wasn't just a drink. It was life. It was a kindness so pure and uncomplicated that it felt like a foreign language. She drank it all, slowly, letting the coolness soothe the raw, parched lining of her throat. As she set the empty cup down, her gaze fell to her feet. They were propped up on a folded blanket at the end of the bed. They were no longer the bloody, swollen masses of pain she remembered. They had been cleaned. The cuts and scrapes were daubed with a dark, stinging antiseptic, and they were wrapped in clean strips of cotton. Someone had touched her. Someone had washed the dirt and blood from her feet while she lay unconscious. The thought should have terrified her, a profound violation. And a part of her did recoil, the part that had been trained to associate any touch with threat. But this was different. The bandages were neat, practical, the work of someone efficient and careful, not cruel. It was an act of impersonal care, like a farrier tending to a lame horse. It was an act of mending, not of taking. She lay back, her head spinning with confusion and exhaustion. She didn't know where she was, or who this silent man was, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the ever-present knot of fear in her stomach loosened its grip. Just a fraction. She closed her eyes, and this time, sleep took her easily, a deep and dreamless slumber that was a healing all its own. When she woke again, the light in the room had softened to the golden glow of late afternoon. A bowl of steaming broth now sat on the crate next to a fresh cup of water. The aroma of wild herbs and roasted meat filled the small room, making her stomach ache with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. She sat up, more slowly this time, and reached for the bowl. It was a simple, thin stew with a few pieces of rabbit and some wild onions. But to her, it was a feast. She ate greedily, the warm liquid spreading through her, chasing away the last of the deep-seated chill. She had just finished the last spoonful when the door opened again. It was him, the man from the well. He stood in the doorway, not crossing the threshold, his large frame filling the space. He was tall, dressed in worn denim trousers and a faded flannel shirt. His face was weathered, his pale eyes holding a neutral, watchful expression. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over, a gesture that seemed oddly uncertain for a man of his size. He didn't seem threatening. He just seemed quiet. They looked at each other in silence for a long moment. Lena's heart was beating a little faster now, but the terror wasn't there. It was replaced by a wary curiosity. He was the one who broke the silence. His voice was low and raspy, as if from disuse. "You were thirsty," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact. She could only nod, her own throat feeling tight and unused. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return, his eyes glancing at the empty bowl. He took a half step into the room, then seemed to think better of it. Stopping just over the threshold, the floorboards groaned. He seemed to fill the world with his presence, yet he was trying to make himself smaller, less imposing. "You got a name?" he asked. The question soft. It wasn't a demand for information, not the way the sheriff or Boyd would have asked it. It was a simple inquiry, offered gently. Lena thought of her name, Lena May. It was the name Boyd had used, drawing it out in a mocking sing-song when he was drunk, or spitting it like a curse when he was angry. The name felt like a collar around her neck, a brand of ownership. She no longer felt like Lena May. That person had died somewhere back on the trail, in the dust and the dark. To give him that name would be to give him a piece of her, a piece that was still bruised and bleeding. She wanted to be no one. No one could be hurt. She shook her head, her gaze dropping to the blanket in her lap. "It doesn't matter," she whispered, the words barely audible. She expected him to press, to insist. That's what men did. They pushed until they got what they wanted. She braced herself for the change in his tone, for the irritation, for the command. But it never came. She risked a glance up at him. He was still watching her, his expression unchanged. He considered her words for a moment, and then he gave another one of those small, quiet nods. "I won't press," he said. And with that, he placed a small stack of folded clothes on the chair just inside the door, a man's shirt and a pair of trousers, old but clean. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone once more in the quiet, sunlit room. Lena stared at the empty doorway long after he was gone. "I won't press," the words echoed in her mind. 4 simple words that were more powerful than any act of charity. He had given her water. He had given her food. He had tended her wounds. And now, he had given her the one thing she hadn't realized she was starving for: a choice. The choice to remain nameless. The choice to keep her secrets. He had respected the boundary she had drawn, a fragile line in the sand of her shattered life. She looked around the simple room again. It wasn't heaven. It was a spare, lonely place at the edge of nowhere. But the air was clean, the silence was real, and for the first time since she could remember, she felt the possibility of being safe. A single, hot tear, the first in many months, escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow or of fear. It was something else entirely, something she couldn't yet name. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, as slow and deliberate as the sun's long journey across the vast, empty sky. Time on the ranch was not measured by the ticking of a clock, but by the shifting of shadows and the quality of the light. Morning began when the eastern mountains were etched in pale gold, and the day's work ended when they turned a deep, bruised purple against the sunset. For Lena, who had lived by the violent and unpredictable whims of another man, this quiet, dependable cadence was a balm. She began by taking small, hesitant steps onto the porch, her healing feet tender on the sun-warmed planks. At first, the sheer scale of the landscape was overwhelming. The sky was an immense, indifferent blue bowl, and the land stretched out in every direction, a tapestry of brown and gray and pale green that seemed to have no end. It was the same wilderness she had stumbled through, a place of terror and desperation. But from the safety of the porch, under the steady, unobtrusive presence of the man whose name she still didn't know, it began to look different. It was not empty, she realized, but simply quiet. It was a land that held its secrets close, a place of resilience where life clung stubbornly to the cracks in the rock and the hard, dry soil. She saw it in the gnarled mesquite that offered shade without promise, and in the stoic, gray-green sagebrush that perfumed the air after a rare, fleeting shower. Her host was a man of similar substance. He moved with the land's rhythm, his silence as natural as the stillness of the midday heat. He never asked her questions, never pried into the past she so clearly carried like a shroud. He simply existed, a solid and predictable force. He would rise before her, and the smell of coffee would already be in the air. He would work from sunup to sundown, his tasks a repeating cycle of mending, tending, and watching. He spoke more to his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Elias, than he did to her. But his few words were always practical, necessary. One morning, she watched him preparing to mend a stretch of fence line at the far end of the pasture. He gathered a roll of wire, a hammer, and a heavy pair of pliers. Without a word, Lena walked back into the house, put on the worn leather gloves he had left on a hook by the door, and followed him out. She didn't offer to help. She just fell into step a few paces behind him. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, and then gave a short, single nod before turning his attention back to the task at hand. That nod was their first real conversation. The work was hard, the sun beat down, and the wire was stubborn and sharp. He showed her how to stretch it taut, his large, calloused hands demonstrating the technique with a patient efficiency. He never grew frustrated when her smaller, less experienced hands fumbled with the pliers or failed to drive a staple in straight. He would simply wait, or quietly take the tool and, with one sure movement, complete the task. They worked side by side for hours. The only sounds, the metallic ping of the hammer against the staples, the creak of strained leather, and the constant, whispering sigh of the wind. In that shared labor, a new kind of silence grew between them. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of her previous life, thick with unspoken threats and simmering anger. This was a clean, expansive silence, like the sky above them. It was a silence built on mutual effort, on the understanding that some things didn't need to be said. They were two solitary people, working together to mend a broken line. The metaphor was not lost on Lena. With every staple she hammered into the wooden posts, she felt like she was fastening a loose piece of herself back into place. A few days later, he was wrestling with a stubborn, half-rotted post, trying to pull it from the ground. With a final, sharp crack of tortured wood, the post gave way, and he stumbled back. A loose strand of old, rusted barbed wire, hidden in the grass, snagged his forearm, tearing a long, shallow gash from his wrist to his elbow. He swore, a low, sharp sound that was startling in its rarity. He looked at the cut, which was welling up with dark blood, with a detached annoyance, as if it were a problem with a piece of equipment rather than a part of his own body. He started to head for the water pump, likely to just rinse it and move on. "Wait," Lena said. Her own voice sounded foreign to her, thin but clear in the open air. He stopped, turning to look at her. She gestured toward the house. "It needs to be cleaned properly, so it doesn't fester." He hesitated for a moment, then gave that same brief nod of acquiescence. Inside, she had him sit at the small wooden table while she retrieved his medical kit. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured whiskey onto a clean strip of cloth. It had been a long time since she had touched another person for any reason other than to fend them off. "This will sting," she said softly. "I know," was his only reply. She pressed the cloth to the wound. He didn't so much as flinch, his arm remaining perfectly still under her touch. His stillness was a gift, an act of trust. He was allowing her to be the caregiver, to be the one with the power to cause a small, healing pain. She cleaned the wound with a careful, focused intensity, her movements becoming more confident as she worked. She then wrapped his arm tightly with a clean bandage, her fingers brushing against his warm, weathered skin. The contact was brief, impersonal, and yet it was a current of communication that ran deeper than any words. When she was done, she looked up and met his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. Lena just nodded. unable to speak past the lump in her throat. In that moment, the dynamic between them had shifted. She was no longer just a broken refugee he had taken in. She was a contributor, a partner in the quiet, shared life they were building, one silent day at a time. The nights were the hardest part. The darkness had always been when her fears grew teeth. In the mining town, the night was never truly dark or quiet, filled with the noise of the saloons and the shadows of dangerous men. But here, the darkness was absolute. A profound black velvet broken only by the cold, distant light of the stars. And the silence was so deep, it seemed to have a sound of its own. In the first few weeks, she would jerk awake from nightmares, her heart pounding, the phantom scent of stale whiskey in the air. But slowly, that began to change. The hard physical labor of the day left her body tired in a clean, honest way. The quiet of the house was a protective embrace, not a threatening void. She began to sleep for a few hours at a stretch without dreaming. Then, one morning, she woke not to the echo of a scream, but to the soft, gray light of dawn filling her room. She lay still, listening. There was no fear, no tightness in her chest. There was only the sound of the wind outside and the feeling of being rested. The realization was so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She was healing. The land, the silence, and the quiet man in the other room were mending her in ways she hadn't thought possible. That evening, a sense of fragile peace settled over her, after their simple meal of beans and cornbread, eaten in their usual comfortable silence. She found herself lingering on the porch instead of retreating to her room. He was in his rocking chair, staring out at the horizon. She sat on the top step, her arms wrapped around her knees, and watched with him as the sky performed its nightly miracle, shifting from brilliant orange to soft lavender to deep, star-flecked indigo. The air grew cool. The world seemed to hold its breath. It was beautiful. So beautiful it hurt. It was a world away from the ugliness she had known. Perhaps, she thought, it was possible to leave the past behind. Perhaps it was possible to start over, to be a new person in a new place. She stayed there until the moon rose, a bright silver sliver in the vast darkness. A feeling of hope, a delicate and unfamiliar emotion, fluttered in her chest. She finally stood, ready for a night she believed would be free of ghosts. She gave a soft good night to the man in the chair, and he answered with a low murmur that was lost to the wind. Back in her room, she didn't light the lamp. She walked to the window, drawn by the stark beauty of the moonlit landscape. The plains were bathed in a pale, ethereal glow, every rock and bush casting a long, dark shadow. Her eyes traced the line of the distant mountains, then scanned the flat expanse of land between, and then she saw it. It was tiny, so small she almost missed it. A pinprick of orange light far out to the east, in the direction of the town she had fled. It was a place where no light should be. It wasn't a star, it was too low, and it flickered. A campfire, or a lantern. The fragile peace that had settled in her heart shattered like glass. The blood in her veins turned to ice. The vast, beautiful landscape instantly transformed back into a threatening wilderness, a place with nowhere to hide. The silence of the night was no longer a comfort, but a cloak for whatever was moving out there in the dark. He had never stopped looking. She had been a fool to think he would. He wouldn't rest until he had his property back. The restful sleep, the healing scars, the quiet days, it had all been a temporary illusion, a borrowed peace. The real world, Boyd's world, was coming for her. She stood frozen at the window, her hand pressed against the cold glass, her breath misting the pain. The light flickered again, a malevolent orange eye in the immense darkness. A whisper escaped her lips, a sound of pure, desolate certainty, swallowed by the silence of the room. He's looking for me. The peace of the night was gone, stolen by that single, distant point of light. Lena stood motionless at the window, her body rigid, every muscle coiled tight. The cold from the glass seemed to seep into her palm, traveling up her arm and settling like a block of ice in her chest. The moonlit landscape, which moments before had seemed so serene and beautiful, was now a hostile, alien terrain. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a hunting ground, and she was the prey. She didn't know how long she stood there, locked in a trance of pure, cold dread. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the before, the fragile, budding hope of the last few weeks, and the now, where that hope lay shattered at her feet. The silence of the house pressed in on her, no longer a comfort but a void that amplified the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. A floorboard groaned in the main room behind her. The sound, as quiet as it was, made her jump, a choked gasp catching in her throat. She spun around, her back pressed against the wall, her hands coming up in a useless gesture of defense. Rafe stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of the dying embers in the stove. He hadn't lit a lamp. He moved in the familiar dark of his home with the quiet confidence of a nocturnal animal. He said nothing, simply stood there, watching her. Even in the gloom, she could feel the weight of his gaze, steady and questioning. "You saw something," he said. It wasn't a question, but a conclusion. His voice was a low rumble, the first sound to break the spell of her terror. She couldn't find her own voice. She could only nod, a jerky, convulsive movement of her head. She turned back to the window, her finger rising to point with a hand that trembled violently. "Out there," she finally managed to whisper, her voice a dry, rasping thing. "A light. To the east." He moved past her, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He didn't crowd her, but stood a few feet away, his broad shoulders blocking out the faint starlight as he peered into the darkness. He was silent for a long time, his focus absolute. Lena found herself holding her breath, waiting for his verdict as if he were a judge about to pronounce her sentence. She half prayed he would tell her she was wrong, that it was just a star, a trick of the moonlight. "A campfire," he said at last, his voice flat and certain. "One man, maybe two. They're a long way off. A day's ride, at least." He didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on that tiny, ominous flicker in the distance. A day's ride? The words were meant to be a measure of distance, but for Lena, they were the ticking of a clock, counting down the last hours of her freedom. The ice in her chest began to melt, replaced by a hot, sickening wave of panic. She wanted to run. The instinct was primal, overwhelming. She wanted to bolt from the house and lose herself in the mountains, to become a ghost in the wilderness. But she knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as stone, that it was useless. He would find her. Boyd always found what was his. "It's my husband," she said, the words tumbling out of her, brittle and broken. "His name is Boyd." Rafe turned his head slowly to look at her. In the dim light, she couldn't read his expression, but she felt the shift in his attention. He was no longer just assessing a potential threat. He was listening to her. For the first time, she was offering him a piece of her past, a shard of the life she had fled. He won't stop," she stammered, the story she had held inside for so long now forcing its way out. "He works for the mining company, but that's not all he does. Men pay him to find things. Or thieves, claim jumpers, runaway workers, people. He's good at it. He likes the hunt." She didn't need to tell him the rest. She didn't need to describe the possessive rage, the casual cruelty, the way he saw her not as a wife but as a possession he had won and had every right to break. She didn't need to explain the fear that had been her constant companion, a shadow that clung to her even in her sleep. She knew, somehow, that this quiet, watchful man understood it all from the few, spare facts she had given him. Rafe didn't ask for more details. He didn't press for the ugly story that was written in the faded scars on her wrists and the haunted look in her eyes. He simply absorbed her words, his silence a strange kind of acceptance. He turned his gaze back to the window, to the distant fire. His jaw was tight, a hard line in the shadows. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moaning softly around the corners of the house. It sounded like a lament. Then, without another word, he moved. He walked to the hearth, where a long, cloth-wrapped object rested on two wooden pegs high above the mantelpiece. It had been there since she arrived, a silent, dusty fixture she had paid little attention to, with a reach that was smooth and economical. He took it down. He carried it to the central table and, in the pool of moonlight slanting from the window, he began to unwrap the oilcloth. It was a rifle, a Springfield carbine, its wooden stock dark and oiled, its long barrel a dull, metallic gray. It was not a farmer's hunting rifle for shooting rabbits. It was a soldier's weapon. Heavy and brutally efficient, it was a piece of the past he had put away, a relic from his life as a cavalryman. Lena watched, mesmerized, as he brought a lamp from the shelf, struck a match, and lit the wick. The flame bloomed, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room, pushing the shadows into the corners. It illuminated his face, revealing a grim, focused intensity. His hands, which she had only known to be gentle and capable as they mended fences or tended her wounds, moved with a new and startling purpose. They were no longer the hands of a rancher. They were the hands of a man who knew how to use the weapon he now held. He worked the rifle's action, the click-clack of the metal components unnaturally loud in the silent house. It was a sound of finality, of a decision being made without words. He squinted down the barrel, then took a soft cloth and a small tin of oil from a nearby drawer. He began to clean the weapon with a slow, methodical rhythm. He didn't rush. His movements were deliberate, ingrained by years of practice. It was a ritual. Lena's panic began to subside, replaced by a strange, unnerving calm. Watching him, she felt a transfer of power. Her fear, which had been a wild, chaotic thing, was being drawn out of her and forged into the cold, hard steel of his resolve. She was no longer alone with her terror. He had taken it from her, shouldered it as his own. He finished cleaning the rifle and then went to a locked wooden chest in the corner. He opened it and took out a box of cartridges. The brass casings gleamed in the lamplight. He opened the box and, one by one, began to check them, his thumb wiping away a thin layer of dust from each one before he lined them up neatly on the table. The small, heavy cylinders of lead and brass were a stark, tangible representation of the violence that was coming their way. The sight should have terrified her. Instead, it was oddly reassuring. This was a language Boyd understood. This was a world Boyd inhabited. And this quiet, solitary man, it seemed, was fluent in it as well. He finished his inspection of the ammunition and loaded the rifle, sliding the cartridges into the mechanism with a series of smooth, precise clicks. He laid the loaded weapon on the table, its dark form resting between them. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the weight of the past and the threat of the future. Lena finally found her voice again. It was small, a mere whisper in the quiet, lamp-lit room. She had to ask. She had to know. If he comes. Rafe didn't look up from the rifle immediately. He ran his hand along the smooth, cool wood of the stock, a gesture that was almost a caress. Then he lifted his gaze and met hers. His pale blue eyes were clear and steady, and in their depths, she saw no fear, no hesitation. She saw only a vast, stark landscape of resolution. "Then we stop running," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but the words landed with the force of a physical blow. He had said we. In that single word, he had built a barricade around her. He had drawn a line in the dust of his quiet life and placed himself on her side of it. He was not just offering her shelter anymore. He was offering her a stand. For him, it was an end to his long retreat from the world. For her, it was the first time in her life that anyone had ever stood with her. And for her. The distant fire still burned in the darkness outside. The threat was still there, a predator stalking the edges of their fragile peace. But for the first time, Lena May felt something other than fear. It was a strange, fierce, and unfamiliar feeling. It was courage. Not her own, perhaps, but a courage she was allowed to borrow, to stand in the light of, and for now, it was enough. The day dawned brittle and tense. The air itself felt different, thin and charged, as if holding its breath in anticipation of a coming storm. The easy, quiet rhythm of the ranch was broken, replaced by a taut, watchful stillness. Rafe didn't go out to the pastures. Lena watched from the kitchen as he moved about the yard, his tasks small and deliberate, all of them keeping him close to the house. He rehung a heavy barn door, the scrape and bang of the iron hinges echoing in the unnatural quiet. He turned the grindstone, sharpening an axe with long, smooth strokes, his eyes constantly scanning the eastern horizon. The Springfield rifle was never more than an arm's length away, leaning against the porch rail or the side of the barn, a silent, grim promise. Lena couldn't settle. She tried to sweep the floor, but the rasp of the broom on the wood grated on her nerves. She tried to knead dough for bread, but her hands were clumsy, her movements jerky. Every rustle of the wind in the eaves, every distant cry of a hawk, sent a jolt of panic through her. Her gaze was a magnet, drawn again and again to the small window that faced east, the direction of the fire, the direction of Boyd. The world outside looked the same pale sun, the same dusty earth, the same endless sky, but it was a facade. She knew that just beyond the curve of the earth, a threat was moving, drawing closer with every passing hour. It was just before noon when she saw it, a faint plume of dust, small and insignificant against the vastness of the plains. It was not the shapeless, shifting dust cloud of a whirlwind. This one was focused, directional, moving with a steady, deliberate pace. It was a rider. "He's here," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. Rafe was on the porch, checking the leather on a saddle. He didn't look up, but his hands stilled. He had already seen it. "One man," he said, his voice calm and low, a rock in the churning sea of her fear. "Stay inside. Keep away from the door." He picked up the rifle and moved to the edge of the porch, positioning himself in the shadow of the overhang. He stood with a deceptive casualness, the rifle held loosely at his side, its long barrel pointing toward the ground. He looked like a simple rancher, waiting to greet a visitor. But Lena, watching from the edge of the window, saw the truth. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the absolute stillness of his head, the way his thumb rested near the rifle's hammer. He was a predator, settled and waiting. The rider drew closer, and the details began to emerge from the haze of dust and distance. He rode a strong, well-muscled bay, not the worn-out nag of a typical prospector. He sat tall in the saddle, and the sun glinted off the silver conchos of his gun belt. He was dressed in sturdy clothes, dusty from the trail but not ragged. Nothing about him suggested he was lost or destitute. Everything about him screamed that he was a man comfortable with violence. He reined his horse to a halt about 20 yards from the porch, his eyes taking in everything at once: the small, defensible house, the sturdy barn, the figure of Rafe standing in the shadows. He raised a hand in a gesture that was meant to be friendly, but it felt like a calculation. "Howdy," the man called out, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that carried easily in the still air. "Hope I'm not trespassing. Been tracking a stream bed for color and got myself turned around. Name's Jeb." He smiled, a wide, easy grin that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were small and sharp, constantly moving, cataloging, assessing. They flicked from Rafe to the house, lingering for a fraction of a second on the windows, as if trying to peer into the shadows within. Rafe didn't move. He didn't return the greeting. He simply waited, his silence a more effective deterrent than any shouted warning. The rider's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. "Bit of a dry stretch out here. My canteen's near empty." Wondered if I might trouble you for some water from that well of yours." "The water's good," Rafe said, his voice flat. He made no move to invite the man closer. Jeb swung a leg over his saddle and dismounted, the jingle of his spurs a sharp, metallic sound. He kept the horse's reins in his left hand, while his right hand hung loosely, unnervingly close to the holstered pistol on his hip. He took a few steps forward, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. He stopped at the edge of the yard, still a good 15 yards away. "Mighty quiet place you got here," Jeb said, his eyes scanning the property again. "Just you out here, all alone?" It was the question Lena had been dreading. It was not an idle pleasantry. It was a probe, the reason he had come. He wasn't looking for water. He was looking for her. Rafe's posture didn't change, but Lena saw his knuckles tighten on the stock of the rifle. "It's quiet enough for me," he answered, his voice level. "A man gets to missing company, though," Jeb pressed, taking another slow step forward. "Especially female company. Heard tell there was a woman who ran out from the progress claim a while back. A man with a certain interest in her asked me to keep an eye out. You wouldn't have seen a stray like that, would you? A pretty little thing. Answers to the name of Lena May. The sound of her own name, spoken by this stranger, in this place that had become her sanctuary, was a physical blow." Lena flinched back from the window, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. It was happening. The outside world had found her. She saw Rafe take a slow, deliberate step off the porch and into the full glare of the sun. He moved into the center of the dusty yard, the rifle still held loosely in his right hand. He was positioning himself, drawing the man's attention, placing his own body squarely between the threat and the house, between the threat and her. "I don't get many visitors," Rafe said, his voice carrying a new, hard edge, "and I don't keep track of strays. You can water your horse, then you can ride on." Jeb's friendly facade finally dropped completely. A cold, thin smile touched his lips. "I don't think so," he said softly. "Boyd pays well for information. He pays even better for delivery. I think I'll just take a look inside that house of yours myself." He dropped the reins, and his right hand moved, a blur of motion toward the butt of his pistol. What happened next was too fast for Lena's terrified mind to fully comprehend. It was a whirlwind of brutal, economic motion. Rafe didn't try to raise the rifle to his shoulder to shoot. There wasn't time. Instead, in a single, fluid movement, he swung the heavy weapon like a club. His body pivoted, his shoulders and hips turning with the force of the blow. The solid wood and steel of the rifle stock arced through the air. Jeb's hand was still inches from his gun when the rifle's stock connected with the side of his head. There was a sickening, wet crunch that was audible even through the glass of the window. Jeb's eyes went wide with a look of pure, animal surprise, his body stiffening for a fraction of a second. Then, all the tension went out of him. He didn't cry out. He didn't even fall so much as collapse. His legs folding under him as if his strings had been cut, he hit the ground in a limp, boneless heap, raising a small puff of pale dust that the wind immediately snatched and tore away. The bay horse shied back, its eyes wide, and galloped a short distance away before stopping, its head up, scenting the air. And then there was silence. The wind, which had been swirling dust around the yard, seemed to die in that instant. The sun beat down on the scene. Rafe stood over the fallen man, his chest rising and falling with his steady breaths. The rifle was back in his hand, held at his side as if nothing had happened. The world was still. The only movement was the twitching of the horse's ears and the slow trickle of dark blood from Jeb's head into the thirsty dust. Rafe didn't waste a moment. He knelt, pulled Jeb's pistol from its holster, and tucked it into his own belt. A quick, professional search of the man's pockets produced a few coins and a half-empty flask of whiskey, which Rafe tossed aside. He then grabbed the unconscious man by the collar and began to drag him, with a grim and startling strength, toward the barn. Lena remained frozen at the window, her body locked in place, her mind reeling. She had just witnessed a moment of shocking, final violence. A man had come, a man had threatened, and a man had been struck down. Just like that. It was over. Her hands, which had been pressed white-knuckled against the windowsill, began to tremble. It started in her fingertips and spread up her arms, a deep, shuddering tremor that shook her entire body. But as she stared out at the now empty yard, at the place where the man had fallen, she realized with a jolt of astonishment that the trembling was not from fear. The fear was gone. In its place was a raw, surging power, an emotion so fierce and unfamiliar she couldn't put a name to it. She had spent years cowering, flinching, absorbing blows, and praying for violence to end. Today, she had seen violence wielded as a shield, as a final, declarative statement. You are not welcome here. You cannot have her. The tremor was the aftershock of a battle that had been fought and won on her behalf. It was the quaking of a foundation that had been violently reset. The world was still a dangerous place. Boyd was still out there. But for the first time, Lena understood that she was not just a victim waiting to be reclaimed. She was a person worth defending. And the quiet man who had just dragged a body into a barn was the one who was defending her. Her trembling hands were not a sign of weakness. They were a sign of the terror being purged from her system, replaced by a terrible, blazing hope. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruised and wounded twilight. The violence of the day had not ended with the striking of the blow or the dragging of the body. It had seeped into the very air of the ranch, leaving a silence that was louder and more terrifying than any scream. Rafe had returned from the barn as the shadows grew long, his face a mask of grim stone. He said nothing of what he had done, and she did not ask. There was no need. The empty space in the yard where the rider had fallen spoke for itself. They ate their evening meal in a silence that was a universe away from the companionable quiet they had shared before. This silence was a wall of glass between them, built of the day's brutal events. Lena could barely swallow the food. Every sound the scrape of a fork on a plate. The sigh of the wind was a gunshot in the dark. After, Rafe had taken his rifle and a cup of coffee and retreated into the main room, which served as his kitchen and living space, leaving her alone in the deepening gloom. Lena sat in her small room, but she could not be still. The four walls that had become her sanctuary now felt like a cage. The adrenaline that had surged through her while she watched the confrontation had long since faded, leaving behind a raw, scraped-out hollowness. The image of the man falling, of Rafe standing over him, was burned into her mind. She saw it every time she closed her eyes. She had witnessed a man defend her, a man risk himself for her. The act was so monumental, so contrary to everything she had ever known, that her mind could not fully grasp it. Men took, men used, men hurt. They did not protect, not without a price. What was Rafe's price? What would he expect in return for the blood that had been spilled in his yard? The old, familiar fear. The fear of the transaction began to creep back in, a cold poison in her veins. But as she sat there, trembling in the dark, another thought pushed its way through the terror. She thought of his hands. The same hands that had swung the rifle with such deadly precision were the ones that had so carefully cleaned and bandaged her feet. The same hands that had dragged a body out of sight were the ones that passed her a cup of water, asking nothing in return. The contradiction was too great, and it was tearing her apart. She couldn't bear the uncertainty. She couldn't live behind the wall of silence that had risen between them. For years, her survival had depended on being silent, on making herself small and invisible. But the violence of the day had changed something fundamental inside her. It had proven that silence and invisibility were no guarantees of safety. The only thing that had kept her safe today was him, and she needed to know if that safety was real, or if it was just another debt she would be forced to pay. The decision to move was one of the hardest she had ever made. It was a rebellion against every instinct for self-preservation she had learned. To be vulnerable was to be in danger. To ask was to invite a demand. But to not ask, to live in this new, terrifying silence, was a kind of death. Her stockinged feet made no sound on the wooden floor as she left her room and walked toward the faint line of light that spilled from under the kitchen door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. She raised a hand to knock, her knuckles hovering just inches from the wood. It took every ounce of her will to make contact, a rap so soft it was barely a sound at all. "Come in." His voice was low, weary. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was sitting at the table, just as she had known he would be. The lamp cast a small, golden circle of light, leaving the rest of the room in deep shadow. His rifle was leaning against the wall next to him, a silent sentinel. He was staring into a half-empty cup of coffee. His broad shoulders slumped. He looked older than he had that morning, the lines around his eyes carved deeper by the day's events. He looked profoundly alone. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes held a deep, bruised sadness. It was the look of a man who had revisited a place he never wanted to see again. She saw no triumph in his gaze, no pride in his victory, only the immense weight of it. She walked to the table and, instead of taking the chair opposite him, she pulled it up beside him, the legs scraping softly on the floor. She sat down, her body angled toward his. Inside the circle of lamplight, the air was thick with things unsaid. She could smell the faint, metallic scent of gun oil and the bitter aroma of his coffee. She looked down at her own hands, resting in her lap. They were red and swollen from the day's panicked grip on the windowsill, from the work of the past weeks. They were the hands of a survivor, scarred and imperfect. Then she looked at his hand, resting on the table near his cup. It was large, calloused, the knuckles scarred. It was a hand capable of both immense gentleness and brutal finality. It was the hand that held her fate. Taking a breath that felt like drawing in shattered glass, she reached out. Her movements were slow, hesitant. She laid her small, trembling hand over his. His hand was warm and solid beneath hers. For a moment, he tensed, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles, the reaction of a man unaccustomed to touch. But he didn't pull away. He simply allowed her hand to rest there, a fragile bridge across the chasm of silence between them. The words came out in a choked, desperate whisper. "I don't know who I can trust anymore," she breathed, the confession tearing from a place deep inside her. It was the simplest, most honest truth she possessed. Her trust had been beaten out of her, leaving nothing but scar tissue. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on their joined hands. He was listening, letting her find her way through the words she so clearly struggled with. She swallowed, her throat tight. Today, She couldn't form a coherent sentence. How could she ask what she needed to know? How could she articulate a question for which she had no words? She wasn't asking for a promise of forever. She wasn't asking for love or affection. She was asking for something far more fundamental. She was asking for a place to stand, for a moment of solid ground in a world that had always been quicksand. But if, she started again, forcing the words out, if I were to ask, right here, right now, the question hung in the air, unfinished, ambiguous, a desperate prayer. Right here, in this small circle of light, with the darkness and the threat of your world held at bay. Right now, in the wake of the blood and the violence, are you a safe harbor? Is this real? Can I believe in this single moment? Is the man who saved me the same man sitting beside me now? It was all of that, and more. It was the plea of a soul that had been running for so long it had forgotten what it felt like to stand still. He understood. In the ruins of his own life, in the profound solitude he had built around himself, he had learned the language of unspoken pain. He heard everything she could not say. He knew this was not a proposition of the flesh, but a petition of the spirit. She was asking for sanctuary, not for a night, but for a moment, a foundation upon which she might begin to rebuild a shattered belief in the goodness of another human being. Slowly, he lifted his other hand. It was trembling, a fine, barely controllable tremor. He raised it and gently, so gently she barely felt it at first. He placed it on her shoulder. The warmth of his palm seeped through the thin fabric of her shirt. A steady, solid pressure. And then they were both trembling. Her body was racked with a shudder that came from the very core of her being, a release of years of terror, of loneliness, of the crushing weight of her own survival. It was the tremor of a wall, long defended, finally crumbling to dust. His tremor was different. It was the shaking of a man touching another soul after years of living with ghosts. It was the shock of her absolute, terrifying vulnerability. It was the immense, crushing weight of the trust she was placing in his scarred, blood-stained hands. He was trembling not from desire, but from the terrifying, sacred gravity of what was passing between them. He was touching something far more fragile and far more powerful than a woman's body. He was touching her trust, a thing he knew, better than most, was the easiest thing in the world to break, and the hardest to earn. In the quiet kitchen, under the soft glow of a single lamp, two broken people sat, their hands trembling, bound together not by passion, but by a force far greater and far more real. They came with the morning's second light, not as a single, cautious scout, but as a thundering pronouncement. 3 riders, dark against the rising sun, their horses eating up the dusty plains. They did not try for stealth. Their approach was an invasion, a statement of ownership. Lena watched from the kitchen window, her hands clenched so tightly around the small, heavy pistol Rafe had given her that her knuckles were white and bloodless. It was the gun he had taken from the man named Jeb, its checkered grip cool and solid in her sweaty palm. It felt impossibly heavy, a weight of decision she had never thought she would have to bear. Rafe was not on the porch. He was already out by the fence line, the same fence they had mended together. He stood near a sturdy corner post, the Springfield rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't exposed. He was simply waiting, a feature of the landscape as permanent and unmovable as the distant mountains. He had told her to stay inside, to bar the door. She had locked it, but she had not retreated to her room. She could not. This was her storm, and she would not cower from the thunder. The riders fanned out as they approached, a classic tactic to prevent a single defender from having easy targets. The man in the center was unmistakable, even from a distance. Lena recognized the arrogant slump of his shoulders in the saddle, the way his hat was tilted back with a swagger. Boyd. His presence was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs, bringing with it the ghosts of 1,000 small cruelties. The 2 men with him were nondescript, hard-faced riders, the kind of men who drifted from one paid violence to the next. They reined in about 30 yards from the fence, their horses stamping and blowing in the cool morning air. Lena May Boyd's voice ripped through the quiet. It was the same voice that had haunted her nightmares, a blend of false charm and raw menace. "I know you're in there, girl. Your little game is over. Come on out. I've come to take you home." Rafe remained silent, his stillness a stark contrast to Boyd's boisterous cruelty. Boyd laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He turned to his men. "See hiding behind some old dirt scratcher? What's he offering you? Lena's safety. There's no such thing for the likes of you. You're mine, always were." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Last chance. Old man, send out what belongs to me, and we'll just take your horses and be on our way." Rafe finally moved. He didn't speak. He simply raised the Springfield to his shoulder, the motion economical and smooth. The metallic click as he cocked the hammer was the only answer he gave. It was an answer Boyd and his men understood perfectly. The world exploded into motion and noise. One of Boyd's men, the one on the right, went for his gun. He was fast, But Rafe was already there. The Springfield bucked against his shoulder, a single, deafening crack that split the morning wide open. The rider on the right was thrown from his saddle as if punched by an invisible fist, a dark red flower blooming on his chest. He hit the ground and didn't move. The second rider, the one on the left, froze for a half-second, his eyes wide with shock. He had come for a simple retrieval, not a battle against a man who could shoot like that. He saw his partner lying dead in the dust. He saw Rafe working the bolt on the rifle with a calm, deadly efficiency. And he made his choice. He yanked his horse's head around, spurred its flanks savagely, and galloped away, leaning low over the animal's neck, a coward fleeing a fight he had no stomach for. It had taken less than 5 seconds. 3 riders had become one. Boyd screamed in rage, a raw animal sound. He was no coward. His fury and his pride were too great. He drew his own pistol and fired wildly in Rafe's direction, the bullet kicking up a spray of dirt a yard wide of the fence post. Rafe didn't fire back immediately. He moved, ducking low and running along the fence line, using the posts for intermittent cover. He was closing the distance, changing the angle. Boyd, still on his horse, was a larger target. He fired again, the shot going high, splintering the top of a post near Rafe's head. From the window, Lena's world had narrowed to the 2 figures in the dusty yard. Her fear was a high-pitched ringing in her ears, but beneath it was a cold, clear focus she had never known. She held the pistol with both hands, trying to steady its wavering barrel. Her arms braced against the windowsill. Rafe dropped to one knee behind a thick juniper bush. Taking careful aim, he fired. The shot was not a killing one. It struck Boyd's horse in the hindquarters. The animal screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound, and bucked violently, its back legs collapsing. Boyd was thrown clear, landing hard on his shoulder with a grunt of pain and surprise. The wounded horse struggled for a moment before falling heavily onto its side, kicking its legs in a dying frenzy. Now they were both on the ground. Rafe moved forward from his cover, his rifle held ready, his steps measured. Boyd scrambled to his feet, clutching his left arm. Blood was already staining his sleeve. A splinter from the saddle or a ricochet had caught him. He was hurt, disoriented, and on foot. He was beaten, but his eyes were filled with a black, venomous hatred. He looked past Rafe, his gaze locking onto the window of the house, onto the pale shape of Lena's face. He saw her, and in that moment of defeat, his priority shifted from survival to destruction. If he couldn't have her, no one would. "You!" he snarled, his face a contorted mask of rage. He ignored Rafe completely, raising his pistol not toward the man who had defeated him, but toward her. He was taking aim at the house, at the window, at Lena's heart. Rafe saw it. He saw the shift in Boyd's eyes, the sudden, spiteful change of target. He was 30 feet away from Boyd, an easy shot, but he also saw Boyd's finger tightening on the trigger. He knew that even if he fired and his bullet was true, Boyd's dying reflex might still send a shot toward the window. There was no time. The calculation was instant, brutal, and selfless. He didn't shoot. He ran. He dropped his rifle and launched himself forward, covering the ground between them in 3 desperate, lunging strides. He was not running to attack. He was running to intercept. He was throwing his own body into the path of the bullet meant for her. The world seemed to slow down. Lena saw Boyd's gun flash, a bright orange star in the morning sun. She saw Rafe's body jolt in mid-stride, a violent, unnatural shudder, as if he'd run into a solid wall. She saw the front of his shirt blossom with a sudden, dark stain. She saw the look of surprise on his face as he stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward until he crashed into Boyd, sending them both tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The sound of the gunshot finally reached her, a flat, ugly crack, and in that instant, the high-pitched whine of fear in her ears went silent. The trembling in her hands stopped. Everything inside her that was soft and frightened and broken turned to ice, and then to fire. He had taken a bullet for her. He had put his life between her and her past. The debt was absolute, and the only payment was this single, final act. She raised the pistol, her arms now as steady as stone. She looked down the short barrel and saw Boyd struggling to push Rafe's limp body off him, trying to bring his gun around for another shot. She saw only the monster who had taken everything from her, the man who had just struck down the only bit of goodness she had found in the world. She pulled the trigger. The small gun kicked hard in her hands, the report sharp and loud. Boyd's struggles ceased. His head snapped back, and he slumped sideways, his gun falling from his nerveless fingers. He lay still, his eyes open and staring at the vast, indifferent blue sky. Silence fell, absolute and profound. It rushed in to fill the vacuum left by the gunfire, a silence as deep and final as the grave. Lena lowered the gun, her arms suddenly weak, smoke, smelling of sulfur and finality, curled from the pistol's barrel. She stared out at the scene. One man dead, one man fled, one man, her monster, lying still in the dust she had kicked from her bare feet, and one man, her savior, lying half on top of him, a dark pool of blood spreading slowly into the dry earth beneath him. A breeze picked up, the first real wind of the day. It whispered through the sparse grass and swirled the pale dust of the yard. It stirred the hair of the fallen men and tugged at a loose strand on Lena's forehead. It felt like a great, cleansing sigh, sweeping over the blood and the bodies, trying to wipe the ground clean of the curse of the past, to carry the ghosts of what had just happened away into the endless, empty sky. The silence that followed the final gunshot was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all other sound for a long, frozen moment. Lena stood at the window, the pistol still clutched in her hands, its weight a dead thing. Her mind was a white, static void. There was the scene in the yard, the still bodies, the wounded horse, the pale dust, and there was the roaring emptiness in her head. Nothing else. Then, a single, terrifying thought cut through the static Rafe. The pistol fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor with a sound that seemed to shatter the silence into 1,000 pieces. The void in her mind flooded with a single, desperate purpose. She fumbled with the bar on the door, her hands clumsy and uncooperative. And then she was running, stumbling across the porch and into the sunlit yard. The world was a blur of motion. She didn't look at Boyd. She didn't spare a glance for the other fallen man. Her eyes saw only the crumpled form of Rafe, lying half across the man she had just killed. She fell to her knees in the dust beside him, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch, afraid of what she might find. Rafe. The name was a ragged whisper, a prayer. There was no response. His face was pale, his eyes closed. The dark, wet stain on the front of his shirt was spreading, a terrible, vivid crimson against the faded blue of the fabric. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She had been too late. But then she saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest. He was breathing. The relief that washed over her was so powerful it was dizzying, a physical force that nearly buckled her. He was alive. He was still here. The realization was a spark in the darkness, and it ignited a fire of fierce, desperate resolve within her. She would not let him die. Her first task was a grim one. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she grabbed Rafe under the arms and pulled. He was a heavy, dead weight, and she had to brace her feet against Boyd's still body to get the leverage she needed. She grunted with the effort, her muscles screaming, her mind refusing to acknowledge the horror of touching the man who had tormented her. Even in death, she pulled and strained, dragging Rafe's limp form inch by agonizing inch until he was clear, lying fully in the dust. The wound was high on his left shoulder, near the collarbone. It was ugly and ragged, bleeding sluggishly. She knew enough to know that it was bad, but perhaps not immediately fatal. She had to get him inside. She had to stop the bleeding. She couldn't lift him. It was impossible. She did the only thing she could. She began to drag him again, this time toward the house. It was a slow, torturous journey. She wrapped his arms around her neck, leaned forward, and pulled, her feet digging into the dirt for purchase, yard by yard. She moved him across the space that had been a battleground only minutes before. The sun beat down. The dust kicked up by her shuffling feet coated them both. By the time she got him onto the porch and through the door, she was gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion, every muscle on fire. She dragged him not to his own bed, but to hers, the one in the small room that had been her sanctuary. It was closer. With a final, desperate heave, she managed to get him onto the mattress, his head lolling to one side, his arms falling limply. For a moment, she sagged against the doorframe, her lungs burning. But there was no time for rest. She ran to the kitchen, grabbing his medical kit, a bucket of precious, clean water from the pump, and every strip of clean cloth she could find. She brought the lamp from the main table and placed it on the crate beside the bed, its steady, golden light pushing back the shadows. Her hands, which had been so clumsy with the door latch, were now steady and sure. A strange, cold calm had settled over her. This was a task, a purpose. It was all that mattered. With a sharp knife from the kitchen, she carefully cut away the bloody fabric of his shirt, exposing the wound. It was worse than she had thought. The bullet had torn through the muscle, and the flesh around the entry point was bruised and swollen. She knew the bullet was likely still inside him. Leaving it there would mean festering, fever, and a slow, certain death. It had to come out. She sterilized the tip of the knife in the lamp's flame, the metal glowing a dull orange. She took a deep breath, her own fear a distant thing. She pressed the cool, clean handle of the knife into Rafe's hand. "Squeeze this," she whispered to his unconscious form, her voice surprisingly steady. "Squeeze this if it hurts." The work that followed was a grim, bloody ordeal. She probed the wound gently with her fingers. Then, with the tip of the sterilized knife, he groaned once, a low, animal sound of pure pain that tore at her heart, and his fingers tightened convulsively around the knife handle he held. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. There was no time for tears. After what felt like an eternity of careful, agonizing searching, she felt the knife tip grate against something hard and metallic, lodged deep against a rib, with the help of a pair of pliers from his tool chest, also sterilized in the flame. She managed to grip the flattened piece of lead and, with a slow, steady pull that made her own stomach churn, she drew it out. It fell onto the floor with a soft, heavy clink. The worst was over. Now, she had to clean it. She poured whiskey into the wound, just as she had done for the gash on his arm. He flinched violently, his back arching off the bed with a strangled cry, even in his unconscious state. This time, the tears did come, hot and silent, rolling down her cheeks as she whispered apologies he couldn't hear. She worked quickly, flushing the wound, cleaning away the blood and grime with a gentle, focused intensity. Finally, she packed the wound with the cleanest strips of linen she had and began to bandage it, wrapping the cloth tightly around his shoulder and chest, creating a thick, absorbent pressure dressing to stanch the bleeding. Her movements were practiced, sure, an echo of the care he had shown her. When she was finished, she finally allowed herself to stop. The room was a mess of bloody rags and spilled water. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp tang of whiskey. Rafe lay on the bed, his breathing shallow but even, his face pale as death in the lamplight. She had done everything she could. The rest was not in her hands. She slid down the wall to the floor, her back pressed against the cool wood, her legs giving out from under her. She sat there, her arms wrapped around her knees, and stared at his still form. And then, the dam broke. A sob, raw and ragged, was torn from the very depths of her soul. It was followed by another and another. The tears she had held back for so long, for so many years, finally came. A flood of grief and terror and a strange, fierce, and overwhelming gratitude. She cried for the horror she had just witnessed, for the man she had just killed, for the final, violent severing of her past. She cried for Rafe, for the terrible pain he was in, for the selfless, insane courage that had made him step in front of a bullet for her. But these were not the tears of a victim. They were not the helpless, frightened sobs of the woman who had run barefoot into the desert. She was crying because for the first time in her life, she understood the profound, earth-shattering truth of what it meant to save and to be saved. She had taken a life to protect the man who had given his own life to protect her. In the crucible of that terrible morning, in the blood and the dust, she had been forged into someone new. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a defender. She was a savior. The weight and the wonder of it were too much to bear, and so she wept, purging the last of the old fear from her soul. She must have fallen asleep there on the floor, her body finally surrendering to its absolute exhaustion. She woke with a start to the soft, gray light of dawn filtering through the window. For a moment, she was disoriented, the events of the previous day a nightmarish blur. Then it all came rushing back, and she scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. He was still there, still breathing. His fever had risen. She could feel the heat radiating from him, and his skin was clammy, but he was alive. She spent the next hours in a quiet, tireless vigil, sponging his forehead with cool water, moistening his cracked lips, and simply sitting by his side, her hand resting near his, not quite touching, just being present. Late in the morning, as the sun streamed into the room, his eyelids fluttered. He groaned softly. Lena's breath caught. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. His eyes opened, just a slit at first. They were unfocused, cloudy with pain and fever. They wandered the room before finally settling on her face. A flicker of recognition, of understanding, entered them. He knew who she was. He knew where he was. She couldn't help it. She reached out and took his hand, the one that wasn't bandaged. His skin was hot and dry, but his fingers feebly curled around hers. The connection was a current of life, of shared survival. She leaned down, her face close to his, and whispered the only words in the world that mattered. "We're both still here." A long moment passed. She thought perhaps he had slipped away again, but then the corner of his mouth twitched, a faint ghost of a smile. His voice, when it came, was a dry, cracked rasp, barely more than a breath. "That's a start." Lena's own lips curved into a watery smile, and a single, fresh tear rolled down her cheek and fell onto their joined hands. She looked out the window. The sky was on fire, a brilliant, breathtaking blaze of crimson and gold. The world outside, the land that had been soaked in blood, was being washed clean, reborn in the light of a new day. And in the small, quiet room, so was she. The weeks that followed were a quiet study in healing. The land itself was the first to forget. The wind and the sun worked together to scour the yard, bleaching the dark stains from the dust until they were nothing more than faint, ghost-like shadows. And then nothing at all. The scarred earth, like the scarred people who lived on it, began the slow, stubborn work of mending itself. Rafe's recovery was a methodical, day-by-day battle. The fever held him in its grip for the better part of a week, a period of hushed anxiety for Lena. She lived in a cycle of changing his bandages, coaxing broth and water between his cracked lips, and sitting in a chair by his bed, watching the shallow, fevered rise and fall of his chest. In his delirium, he sometimes spoke fragmented words from a life she didn't know a woman's name. Sarah, a shouted command from a battlefield long past. She listened to these broken pieces of his past not as an intruder, but as a guardian. her presence a silent promise to keep his ghosts at bay. During this time, the ranch became hers. The world shrank to the size of the property line, and her life was measured in a litany of chores. She learned the rhythms of the land not as a guest, but as a steward. She fed the few chickens, collected their eggs, milked the lone dairy cow. She drew water from the well, the same well where he had found her, the creak of the rope and pulley a familiar, comforting sound. The work was hard. Her muscles ached, but it was a clean, honest pain. It was the pain of effort, not of injury. It grounded her, tethering her to the present moment, leaving little room for the ghosts of her own. One morning, when his fever had finally broken, she woke to find him watching her as she moved about the small kitchen. His eyes were clear, the fever gone, leaving behind a profound weariness but also a quiet lucidity. "You've been busy," he said, his voice a dry rasp. Lena's heart gave a little jump. There were things that needed doing, she replied simply, bringing him a cup of fresh water. As he drank, his eyes followed her. He saw the new confidence in her step, the way she moved through his home as if she belonged there. He saw the efficient way she stoked the fire and set the coffee pot on to boil. She was no longer the broken, terrified creature he had found by the well. The fear was still there, in the shadows of her eyes, but it no longer owned her. She had met the worst the world could throw at her, and she had survived. More than that, she had fought back. His recovery was her project. As he slowly regained his strength, a new dynamic formed between them. He, who had been her silent, capable protector, was now dependent on her for everything. This reversal of roles, which could have been awkward, instead became a bridge. She helped him to the porch so he could feel the sun on his face. She read to him from a tattered copy of Shakespeare she found in his wooden chest, her voice soft and hesitant at first, then growing stronger as she lost herself in the words. They spoke more in those weeks of his convalescence than they had in all the time before. Their conversations simple. Practical things about the ranch, the weather, the mending that needed to be done. They were building a new life, sentence by sentence, chore by chore. She also learned to smile again. It didn't happen all at once. It started as a faint twitch of her lips when one of the chickens did something particularly foolish. It grew into a small, private smile when she saw a calf kick up its heels in the morning light. The first time he saw it, he was sitting on the porch, watching her mend a tear in one of his shirts, her head bent in concentration. A breeze caught a loose strand of her hair and whipped it across her face. She brushed it away with a sigh of exasperation. But then, a genuine, unburdened smile touched her lips. A brief flash of light. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. When he was finally strong enough to walk without leaning on her, he decided it was time. "You need to learn to ride," he announced one afternoon. The thought terrified her. A horse meant speed, power, a lack of control, but it also meant freedom. It meant the ability to choose your own direction, to flee if you had to, but also to explore, to move towards something instead of just away. He chose Elias, his own steady, dependable buckskin. His touch with the animal was a marvel to her. He spoke to it in low, soothing tones, his hands gentle on the reins, on the horse's neck. He showed her the basics: how to saddle the horse, how to hold the reins, how to mount, when it was her turn to get on. She hesitated, her old fears rising up. He saw the fear in her eyes and simply stood beside her, waiting. He didn't push, he just created a space of patient silence, giving her the room to find her own courage. She took a breath and, with his steadying hand on her arm, she pulled herself into the saddle. The world looked different from up high. She felt a surge of both terror and exhilaration. He didn't let go of the bridle at first, walking beside her, his presence a solid anchor. He taught her about balance, about moving with the horse, not against it, about a gentle hand on the reins. "He'll know if you're scared," Rafe told her, his voice calm and even. They feel everything. Just breathe. Trust him. Trust yourself. That was the hardest part, trusting herself. But day after day, they practiced in the corral. Her fear slowly receded, replaced by a growing confidence. She learned the rhythm of the walk, the gentle bounce of the trot, and one day, when the sun was warm on her back and a sense of profound peace had settled over the ranch, Rafe let go of the bridle and stepped back. She was on her own. She rode a few hesitant steps, then urged Elias into a slow, rocking canter. The wind rushed past her ears, pulling her hair from its bun, and she laughed. It was not a smile, but a full, throat-clearing laugh. A sound of pure, unadulterated joy. A sound of freedom. From that day on, the last of the shadows seemed to retreat. The past was not forgotten. The graves on the far side of the hill were a stark reminder. But it was no longer a haunting. It was just a fact, a scar on the land and on their hearts, a part of the story that had brought them to this quiet, sun-drenched present. One morning, weeks later, the air was soft and cool, holding the promise of a gentle day. Rafe was on the porch in his rocking chair, his shoulders still stiff but mostly healed, his strength fully returned. Lena came out of the house carrying 2 tin cups of steaming coffee. She handed one to him, their fingers brushing for a moment, a casual touch that was now as natural as breathing. She sat on the top step, leaning her back against the post, and sipped her coffee, her gaze on the soft, hazy line of the distant mountains. They sat in their familiar, comfortable silence for a long time, watching the world wake up. "Did you ever think about leaving this place?" Lena asked, her voice soft, almost a part of the morning quiet. Rafe stopped rocking. He followed her gaze to the mountains, to the vast, empty land he had chosen as his exile. "I did," he said, his voice low and honest. He thought of the years of loneliness, of the crushing weight of his grief, of the days when the silence had been a roaring in his ears. He had thought of just riding away and never looking back many times. He turned his head and looked at her. He saw the way the morning sun caught the gold in her hair, the quiet strength in the set of her jaw, the peace that had finally settled in her eyes. He saw the woman who had brought life back into his silent house, who had faced down her own demons and his, and who now sat beside him as if she had been there always. "But not anymore," he said. A slow, gentle smile touched Lena's lips. She nodded, a small, understanding gesture. She looked from the mountains back to him, her gaze direct and clear. The question that had been a desperate, fearful plea in a dark kitchen was now something else entirely. It was an offering. It was a beginning. "So," she said, her voice a soft murmur, full of a hope that was as bright and new as the morning itself. "If I said, right here, right now?" He didn't answer with words. He reached down and took her hand, the one resting on her knee. His fingers laced through hers, a warm, solid, and certain grip. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, a silent promise that held everything inside it, all the pain of the past, all the peace of the present, and all the hope of a future they would build together, in this very spot. They sat there, their hands joined. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they didn't need to speak. The world with all its noise and its fury could rage on beyond the mountains. It couldn't touch them. They had found their center, their quiet place. They had found it in the dust, in the blood, and in the silence. They had found it in each other. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.